on this morning, so if someone could tell me at 10:15, yes, 10:15, that would be great. Yeah. Now, if the Bible study is boring and you feel like you want to tell me earlier, you can do that. You know, wait at least 15 minutes so that I don't feel bad. You know. But okay, thank you for everybody coming. I sure appreciate it. We have been talking about the topic of worship and the Lutheran difference. That's really the topic that we've been looking at. So we have finished with the Bible study pages that I provided earlier. And so I wanted to take a few weeks just to talk about some other things. This Bible study will lead us up to Christmas, and then we'll have some special things. And then in the spring, we'll start on January 6th. We will start with a new series on Bible study. So just be aware of that, what that's coming up. What I want to talk about this morning is looking at worship in the Old Testament. What was worship like in the Old Testament with the Jews? Not only in the tabernacle, but also the temple, right? And especially want to look at how do we see things that we do today reflected in the tabernacle and also the temple, right? Because one of the things we want to get out of this Bible study is seeing that the stuff we do in worship is not just pulled out of nowhere, right? It wasn't just a bunch of drunk Germans that decided, hey, you know what, let's put this in there and see how it works, you know. That the foundations were in place, a long time ago. So, what I'd like to do is to give us a little bit of context. In other words, when is all this happening, right? The Old Testament is very big, and so I always try to give us some help us to focus on the area that we're looking at a little bit. Okay, so. These things, when we talk about how old the world is and the different chunks of the Old Testament. So if creation is about 4,000 years before Jesus, how old is the earth roughly? Yeah, about 6,000 years old. About 6,000 years old. So just to give us a little background, we have creation until the patriarchs. And the patriarchs, that's a fancy word for Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. That's what that's talking about. So that is about a 2,000-year period. And then you have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob for about, looks like about 200 years. Then Joseph is Pharaoh in Egypt, but then he dies, and a new Pharaoh comes, and the Israelites are slaves in Egypt for 400 years, over 400 years. And then the Exodus happens, and then the people of Israel escape slavery, and they wander around in the desert, all right? And you can see that period of time. It was 40 years. God said that you're going to have to wander around because of your disobedience, and then your children will be able to go into the promised land. All right, your children will go into the promised land. What we want to talk about is worship while they were wandering in the wilderness. That's what we're looking at, because God gives them worship. He brings them out of slavery, and then he says, I'm going to be with you, and this is how I will be with you in worship. Okay, kind of recapping what I just talked about. Joseph becomes the Pharaoh. He has 75 children, 200 years go by, and everything is good. So all of these Hebrews are having children during those 200 years, generations of people. So there's a lot of Israelites in slavery in Egypt. A new Pharaoh comes along, they're enslaved for 430 years, and roughly 600,000 Israelite slaves leave in the Exodus. So you can imagine this huge caravan of people leaving Egypt, massive amounts of people. Fort Wayne, depending on how you count it, is about 330, 350,000. So you can imagine how many people this is. All right? Questions about that? Kind of the chunk of time that we're looking at. All right, it's really about 40 years that the span when they're worshiping. All right? Now they're wandering, so worship has to be portable. It has to be portable. So what happens in the book of Numbers, we learn about how this is all set up. So look at all those little iceberg thingy-dingies surrounding. What are those? They're tents. And who lives in the tents? Yeah, the people, right? The people live in the tents. And God was very specific. He didn't say, pitch your tent anywhere you want. He said, the tribe of Reuben, you camp here. The tribe of Judah, you camp here. The tribe of Benjamin, you camp here. So it was all organized by tribe. And so you would camp near all of your kin. All of your family members would camp together. Okay? Then you see this area enclosed by a white fence. It's the fence, and then it has cloth over it. Inside of that, right, that's considered the courtyard, and we'll look at that. But a couple of things. You see that big tent, all right? That's where the holy place is and the most holy place. What is that coming off of the big tent? Smoke. What else could it be? It's actually a cloud. Now you're right, you see the altar there, that smaller object with smoke coming off of it, that's the altar, that's smoke. Remember that in the Old Testament, God said that I will be with you either in fire or in a cloud. I'll either be with you in fire or a cloud. Okay? So that's what's happening there. So this is how God said we're going to worship. We're going to stop, everybody pitch your tent, and then we're going to have worship inside the tabernacle. All right? That's what's going on. Questions or comments? Yeah, they moved from one place to the next. The exact route, I don't know if we know that. I mean, the Bible does talk about how they went to different locations, but I'd have to find a map to show. But they all went from one place to the next as a group. Yeah, for a period of time, and it really was kind of a challenging situation because God basically said that wherever the cloud stops, that's where you should set up camp. Wherever, in other words, wherever I stop, that's where you set up camp. And then, wherever I go, you set up camp. So really, they didn't have much warning because, you know, their camp and everything is set up, and they did all this work to set up camp, and then God says, well, we're moving this place. And so he just moves the cloud. And so then they have to pack everything up real quick and move to the next spot. All right, so this is the time when they're receiving quail and manna, and they're receiving water from the rock, that whole bit, right? All of that is during this period of time. So, so you can imagine the pressure on Moses, that he is responsible for over 600,000 people. Now, obviously, he had helpers. Joshua was, of course, his second, but he also had helpers. You know, you had to have leaders in each family so that stuff could happen. But Moses is bearing a huge load that he didn't ask for, right? If you've ever been put in charge of something or volunteered for something, you know what that's like. When you're doing something that you didn't ask to do and you're put in charge, Moses is dealing with that for a long time. Okay? All right, would somebody read for us, please, Exodus 13. Exodus 13. Okay, so God would move at different times, and so he would use fire and clouds. Now, where else do we see God with clouds? Okay, yes, so the Lord descended in a cloud on Mount Sinai to give the Ten Commandments? Yeah. Yep. Yeah, the burning bush is another, is a fire, is example of fire. Absolutely. That I would have to check. It's very possible. But we know that that's an example of fire. Where else do we see cloud? Yeah, the ascension is another one. The baptism of Jesus is another one. Okay. Where else do we see fire? Pentecost, the burning bush. What else? I'm trying to think. Yep, the coming of the Holy Spirit. Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, that happened. What else? Anything? Sodom and Gomorrah. Yeah, the burning sulfur. Yeah, that's not a good scene, right? So that was definitely God showing himself in wrath, right? After an enormous amount of mercy, though, an enormous amount of mercy. Okay. And then, of course, Exodus 24, Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain, and he was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Just to make other connections, how many days did Jesus wander while he was not eating or drinking? 40? Yep. The people wandered in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. The boat, or the ark, 40 days and 40 nights, all right? So we don't want to go into all that here, but I just want to always plug these things, that the numbers have meaning. When we look in the Bible, the numbers have a lot of meaning, and you see all of this happening, okay? Suffice it to say that Jesus wandering in the wilderness is basically him going through what the people of Israel did in the desert. That's what that's about, all right? But that's another topic. Okay, Exodus 40, verse 36, please.
Throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people of Israel would set out.
Okay, so basically they were at the Lord's beck and call, is wherever he's leading them. So in a sense they were wandering, in a sense they weren't, right? Remember that Egypt, if you picture Egypt here, well, Israel is basically a straight shot up, kind of a curved shot up. So they certainly did not take the most efficient direct route they could. No doubt about it at all. They had to go over and wander around for a while, going to different places. All right? Now, we said, I just want to make one thing clear. We said that the people of Israel had to wander because of their disobedience. But that doesn't mean they didn't go to heaven. All right? God brings punishment on us, discipline on us all the time. That doesn't mean that he throws us into hell. Right? So the people did not get to enter the promised land, which was too bad, but that doesn't mean that they died and went to hell. All right? Those who trusted in the coming Savior, Jesus Christ, certainly went to heaven. Those who trusted in the coming Savior. All right? Okay. Would somebody read for us 1 Thessalonians 17, please? Okay, so that tells us some interesting things. Remember, we talked about just a minute ago that when Jesus ascended, he was taken up in the clouds. And the angels said, what did the angels say to, well, the angels said a couple of things to the disciples, okay? So the disciples are all kind of like this. Okay, what do we do now? And then some angels show up, and they tell the disciples a couple of things. What did they say? Yeah, why are you here? Why are you looking into the sky? He's not here anymore, right? And they said, and then they went into the temple to worship, right? What else did they say? What did they say about the way he will come back? Yes, he'll come back the same way he left. And so Scripture bears that out. This is St. Paul, years after that, writing, "We who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. So we will always be with the Lord." So that helps us. This is popular at funerals. And what it describes is that Jesus will come back. He will come out of the clouds with his angels. It will be a big deal. You won't miss it. He will come with his angels. And who's going to go up first? Who will go up first? Yes. So those who have died in the Lord. In other words, people who are buried in the earth who are Christians, they will go first. Then everybody who's alive as Christians will go next. Why the Lord decided to take the buried Christians first, I don't know, but that's the way it will go. So that's where we get that we who are alive, Christians who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will always be with the Lord. All right, so that's how things will go, and we can count on that. Revelation talks about some other things that will happen when Christ returns that are also that are kind of dramatic, but this will be our wonderful thing. We hear in the Bible about a trumpet call, about the sky peeling back, about the stars and the moon and the sun melting, all sorts of things. Comments or questions? Okay, would somebody read for us Matthew 17, 4-6? Okay, so the disciples understood that they were in the presence of God, not just God the Father, but also God the Son. What do we call this event in our church talk? Yeah, well, not the ascension, not yet. He hasn't gone to die on the cross yet. Remember, they're on the mountain, and Elijah, Moses, and one for Elijah. What's this? Starts with a T, rhymes with transfiguration. Yeah. All right, so this is transfiguration. This is the part where Jesus is glorified. So Jesus is walking around during his whole ministry, and he looks very humble, very normal, right? But right before he goes into Jerusalem to die, he is glorified on the mountain. Right? And you see the cloud, and you see Moses and Elijah. And that whole thing, that's another whole big study we could do. But there's Jesus, the Son, who fulfills the prophets, represented by Elijah, and fulfills the law, represented by Moses. So he is the fulfillment of those things, right? And so that, the point is that we see him in the cloud. We also see him at his baptism. All right. Now, this is kind of a long view of, this is the same thing as that. All right, so this rectangular space. All right. Now, what I would encourage you to do is to start at the bottom of the screen and work your way up. So picture this, it's called the tabernacle. Picture this, and it's surrounded by tents, all the people of Israel gathered around. Okay? And then the courtyard was basically the area that you would enter before. So you would enter down here at the courtyard, and then you had the altar. Okay, and what happened at the altar? Sacrifices, animals, oil, grain, all sorts of things. Okay, now what's next? The laver, yeah. So what do you do at the laver? All right. Have you ever heard of the soap called lava? What do you do with soap? You wash. So it's basically a big bird bath is what you want to picture. Is a huge bird bath. All right. Now, as we're working through this, as we're talking about the tabernacle, I want you to start thinking to yourself, where is this in our worship today? Where is this in our worship today? All right, and don't answer yet, all right? We want to save the suspense. But as we go through each part, I want you to look at where is this today? All right, so notice that we go to the altar first, then the laver, all right? And that's related to other words like lavatory. What do you do in the lavatory? Wash up, right? Yep, okay, so that's where that's coming from. So you go through there. Now, one thing that I forgot to mention, and this is neat. Let me go back here a little bit. Boing. No. Okay. The tabernacle, the place of worship, is in the center of all the people. Why is that significant? Make sure everybody can get there. So it's practical, right? What else? Exactly. Worship, Christ is supposed to be the center of everything that we do. They could have put the tabernacle way out of town, way beyond the tents. They could have put all the tents together in one big wad and then had the tabernacle out. No. We're going to have God and worship right in the center. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that should inform where we put churches today. My point is rather that it wasn't by accident. The idea is that God is the center. He is the absolute most important thing in what we're doing. Okay? All right, back to this then. Then, the tabernacle proper, in other words, what we really call the tabernacle, is this tent. And you should see two big sections. The front part is called the holy place, or the holy, right? And the second part, the back part, is the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place. Okay? So in this front half, you have these three things. You have the golden lampstand, and we're going to talk about that, the golden lampstand, the table of showbread, which is also called the bread of presence, okay? And then the incense altar, right? Then the incense altar. And we're going to talk about what those things are and why, what they mean and why they're significant. But you have to go through the curtain in order to get to the most holy place. You have to go through the curtain to get to the most holy place. All right? Now, who was the only person who could go into the Holy of Holies? And not just a priest, but the high priest, right? Whoever was designated for that year could go into the Holy of Holies. And what was the only day he could go in there? Only one day a year, and it's not Christmas. What's the only day he could go in? The Day of Atonement. Does anybody know what you call that in Hebrew? Yom Kippur, right? Yom Kippur. So if you're familiar, if you have Jewish friends, the Day of Atonement is Yom Kippur, right? So you can see why that's a significant day to Jews, even today, right? So on the Day of Atonement, only the high priest could go into there. And why is that? Because the Ark of the Covenant is in there. So when you think that, you want to think Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, all right? That's what we're thinking about. Sorry? Yes. Yeah. So what I want you to notice here is that this painting doesn't exactly do it right, but what I want you to see is that Jesus, God would come and he would come down right over the Ark of the Covenant. Not just over the tent, but right over the Ark of the Covenant. Right over in the Holy of Holies, right over the Ark of the Covenant. Because that was where God said he would be present with the people. Not in the whole tent, but just right there in the Ark of the Covenant. So you can see why God says, be careful, because you're coming right into my presence. I'm right here with you, and so only the high priest once a year, right? Okay, now, to make a connection, what happens right after Jesus dies? What happens right when he dies on the cross? The purple curtain tears in half from top to bottom. Okay? So the temple curtain is the temple curtain in the tabernacle. That was the curtain that separated the most holy place from the holy place. In other words, when Jesus dies, the curtain that blocks off the presence of God is torn in half. What's the connection? What does that have to do with Jesus dying on the cross? He brought us to God. So, why is it that it's dangerous to go into God's presence? Because of sin. Jesus dies on the cross and takes the sin away. Now, anybody can go into the presence of God safely. Are you with me? Through Christ. I want to make sure I add that little caveat, is that we can go into the presence of God safely through Jesus. So the temple curtain tearing when Jesus dies is saying, through Jesus you can now come into my presence without danger. Okay? That means that through Christ we can approach God's altar and receive his body and blood. Okay? So, does that make sense? That's important to see that between the death of Jesus and the tabernacle, what that's about. Okay, good. Any questions? Yeah, a temple is kind of the modern day version of a tabernacle. The tabernacle is basically a portable temple. And so they're the same, roughly. The synagogue was basically a space for study and preaching. So in the synagogue, you would preach, you would teach, and you would fellowship. And basically, you would do everything except like altar sacrifices. So it's essentially like doing preaching and Bible study. That's what you did in the synagogue. Yeah, and so that there, you could come and be there. However, only priests and teachers of the law could teach. So you get the big part of that Jesus steps up, this carpenter from Nazareth of Samaria. He gets up and he starts teaching with authority. When did Jesus go to school? When did he graduate from rabbi school? Right? He didn't. But he's in the synagogue teaching as one with authority. Okay. Other questions? Yes. Say that once more. That's a good question. That is a good question. We know that because his word was being read and preached, that he was present there. But I don't know if the Jews recognized his presence in the synagogue or not. That's a good question. Yeah, that's how they understood it. That's a good question. Okay, going on from there, a couple of thoughts about how the tabernacle worked. The priest would slaughter animals brought by the families. So basically what would happen is, I choose an animal that I have to sacrifice for my family. I bring it to the priest. who then puts it for me on the altar and sacrifices it. That was part of their job. So you can imagine being a low-level priest in the tabernacle, and what are your clothes going to look like? Yeah, you're going to look like you work in a butchery, right? That's what it's going to. You're going to be covered in blood and entrails all over the place, right? So get some Clorox, stain-resistant robes, so that it's a bloody mess, right? That's what they did. That's what they did, and continued to do in the temple. All right. So that's what they would do. Only the priest could enter the most holy place. Or excuse me, only a priest could go into the tabernacle at all. Only a priest could do that. Okay, then only the high priest could enter the most holy place, and only on one day of the year, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Okay, the priests could eat the bread of presence only after fresh bread was placed. Okay, so you see that spot right there with the table of showbread, the bread of presence? God said to the people that when you build the tabernacle that you should have a table, and on that table you should have bread, unleavened bread. Okay? And on that table you should have 12 pieces of unleavened bread. 6 in one stack, 6 on the other stack. Okay? Why 12 pieces of unleavened bread? One for each tribe. How many disciples? 12, or apostles, actually. Yeah, 12. Okay? So we recognize that. What does the Bible say in Revelation? 144,000, right? 12 times 12 times 1,000, 144,000. All right? So all these interesting connections that go on. So the bread was there, and it would stay there the whole week until fresh bread was brought, and that would be placed on the temple, on the table of showbread, and then the priests could eat the rest. All right, so I don't know if it was stale or, it was unleavened bread to begin with, so it's not, it's not real fluffy. But you want to see how the whole system works. The priests rely on what is brought to the temple for their food, right? They don't get paid, so to speak. So what do they eat? They eat the showbread after new showbread is brought. They eat the remainder of the meat of the animals. Okay, that's all for Aaron and the Levites to be sustained. All right, that's what that's for. Okay, not unlike what we do today. Right, my salary, is derived from the offerings to the church, right? So, not unusual. Comments or questions? Okay. All right. Okay. Now a closer look at these objects. The one on the top is the Ark of the Covenant, right? The one in the middle is the incense table, right? The one to the left is the candlestick or the candelabra, whatever you want to call it. And then on the right, you see the showbread, the table of showbread. Underneath is the laver, okay, and under that is the altar, okay. So we're going to take a closer look at all of those and why they're significant. But the person who put this picture together obviously intended that they would be put in the shape of a cross. Now, as we look at these, what I want you to see is not only how do we have that in a certain way today, but how do they point to Jesus? How do they point to Jesus? Remember, Jesus doesn't come to the scene in Matthew. Jesus is all over. He's with us the whole time in the Old Testament. All right. You shall make a lampstand of pure gold. The lampstand shall be made of hammered work. Its base, its stem, its cups, its calyxes, and its flowers shall be one piece of it. Okay? So if you read about how this is described, this lampstand You didn't have candles on the tops of it. That wasn't it. It was actually little golden oil lamps. So you were actually lighting this little golden oil lamp, and you had a certain number of them. Okay. Does anybody here enough of a botanist to know what a calyx is? Anybody know? Calyces. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, and that I think makes sense. The periphery there makes sense, because if you picture a rose, so you have the stem, and on the stem you have leaves coming off of it, and of course thorns. You also have the flower itself, which is the red, and then under the flower you have little petals of green surrounding the red flower. The petals of green surrounding the red flower, those are the calyxes. So basically what's being described here is you're going to put flowers on this, right? The base, the stem, its cups, and its calyxes, and its flowers shall be of one piece with it. All right? Now, this should not come as a surprise. How many lamps on the lampstand? 7. Where else do we encounter the number 7? Days of the week. Where else? Yes, right? The 7 churches, right? How many times do we forgive our neighbor? Right? And what Jesus really means there is without limit. That's his point. Okay? But there's 7s all over the place. If you go to like BibleGateway.com and you type in the word 7, you will find endless references to the number 7 in the Bible, right? So it's no mistake. Sorry? Right. It's a number that expresses completion. Okay, so you can see that, all right? Okay, let's look up a couple things. Would somebody read Genesis 2:2, please? Okay, so an expression of completion. Somebody read Genesis 7:4.
For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth, 40 days and 40 nights. And every living thing that I have made, I will blot out from the face of the earth.
Okay, so not a good day, right? In 7 days, I'm going to do this. And remember the number 40. 40 days and 40 nights, I'm going to make it rain. Jesus wandered for 40 days and 40 nights, no food. The people of Israel wandered for 40 years, right? So you can see those numbers coming out. All right, Matthew 15:34. Okay, so 7 loaves of bread. All right. My point in detailing all of this is to show you that God didn't just say, well, that would look pretty. Let's put that in there, and this will look nice, and wow, that'll look cool too. But all of these little furnishings have deep meaning, and God gives specific instructions on how they're to be produced. Matthew 18:21-23, please. Okay, and you remember how that goes along with the account of the servants and so forth. So, more examples. Revelation 1:20. Somebody who hasn't read today.
As for the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches.
Okay. Again, just hitting on that number 7 again. Okay, so closer up drawings, you see here the table of showbread. You see the table, you can see the knobs which were used to carry it. Okay, the whole thing is laid over with gold, and you see the 2 stacks. You see the 2 stacks. Then you see the Ark of the Covenant. All right, what I think is so cool is that Jesus in the Old Testament, he describes the Ark of the Covenant, that it's supposed to be covered with all gold. Then you'll have 2 cherubim on it, and cherubim are angels, and they are to be facing one another. So this drawing points us in the right direction. What I always like to think of when I see and hear that described is Jesus in the manger, and you have the shepherds and the wise men who aren't there yet, but the shepherds and the angels who are there surrounding and hovering over Jesus because of that. You know, I don't know if there's a connection really, but it makes me think of that. All right? Okay, and this will be a sign for you. You will find a baby wrapped in swaddling cloths and lying in a manger. And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among those with whom he is pleased." All right? So you can imagine that the shepherds are using the defibrillator on each other because of this tremendous shock of all these angels showing up and singing to them out in the wilderness. Okay? All right. Numbers 17, verse 8, please. Would someone read that? Okay, so the reason I bring that up is to talk about what was in the Ark of the Covenant. What was one thing that was in the Ark of the Covenant? Yeah, were the 10 Commandments, right? The 10 Commandments was in there. Aaron's staff, right? I'm trying to think of something else that was in there. I always make the joke that a copy of TLH was in there too, but you know, fewer and fewer people recognize that reference. But it's the red hymnal that we used in the LCMS for generations. I mean, just long time. You know, and there was uber huge resistance to breaking out of that hymnal and trying something else. So the joke. I'm old enough to know that we started with the red hymnal. When I was just a kid, we were using red, and then we moved to the blue hymnal, and then finally to what we have today. So it was moved. It was moved and then lost, and I get the exact. It was a couple of times. Foreign enemies would come and steal it. And then at some point it was lost, and I'd have to look that up. But yeah, like they didn't have it in Jesus' day. It wasn't there anymore. No, not the original ark. But that would be another interesting study too, to look at that. Okay, now here is really the payoff. Here's the next we want to make. How is Jesus the fulfillment things in the tabernacle? So the things that we saw, the showbread, the incense, the lampstand, right? The Ark of the Covenant. Okay. So first of all, the incense. I forgot to talk about that. There was a table on which you would burn incense, and this was like not liquid. It wasn't like a liquid that you would pour on something, but rather like incense sticks, you know, and then they would be lighted and burning in the holy place. All right. So the reason God told people to burn incense is so that it would create a pleasing aroma to the Lord. That was the idea. Let the incense produce a pleasing aroma to the Lord. All right. So how does Jesus produce a pleasing aroma to the Lord? What do you think? Well, first of all, what stinks in the nose of God? How does Jesus replace that with a pleasing aroma? Yeah, by his death on the cross, by forgiveness of sins, we now produce a pleasing aroma to the Lord. No longer holds the sting of sin because Jesus has taken it away. Okay, so we make that connection. How about the laver, where you would wash before you went into the holy place? Where do we see that? Baptism. Yeah, baptism. Washing. All right, baptism. How about the altar? Where do we see that? A couple of different ways we see Jesus. For prayer? Sure, what else? What do we place on the altar for service? Bread and wine, which becomes Christ's body and blood, and the blood is essential there. Okay? So, sorry? Right, in the Holy Bible. So on the altar, on this altar in the Old Testament, you would slaughter animals. On this altar, we have blood, but it's the blood of the final sacrifice, Jesus Christ. Does that make sense? So we have blood. It is blood. We have blood on this altar, the same way they had blood on their altar, but their altar was pointing to Jesus, the Lamb who was shed, who was slaughtered for us. Notice this. This is important to see in terms of that we worship. Okay. When you come into the tabernacle, what do you do first? A sacrifice has to be made before you can go any further. A sacrifice is made before you can go any further. What do we do at the first part of our service? After the greeting, after the opening hymn, what's first? Yeah, confession of sins and forgiveness, right? Yeah. By the way, what time is it? 10:05. Great. Okay. So, notice the same way. Before we continue with the rest of the service, we get our sins forgiven. And now we are able to come before the Lord. Same thing here. A sacrifice is made, and now we can approach the Lord. Does that make sense? Okay, you see Jesus in that, right? The idea that I want to leave you with in the Bible study is not to memorize all of these details, but instead to see the connection between that and what we do today, also to see how Jesus is the center of all of it. All right, so the table of showbread, where do we have bread in worship? Right here, unleavened bread, okay? So we receive that. That makes sense. Jesus is the bread of life. Remember John 6. The land. Okay, we see the number 7 there. Jesus is the light of the world. Okay, and the Ark of the Covenant, of course. Now, the Ark of the Covenant, wherever it is of course a very important piece. Of course, it's very valuable. It's very important in our history, right, as Christians. However, we don't need the Ark of the Covenant to go into the presence of God anymore. And why is that? Yeah, because Jesus' death and resurrection allows us to come into his presence. And that's what we do. When we come into the altar and there's the body and blood there, we are coming into the presence of God. Right? Okay. Got just a few minutes left, I think. Okay, and we kind of talked about this. How are these items reflected in our worship services? And we talked about that, where you see these things there. Okay, the final slide that I want to show you, this is not St. John's Sanctuary. This is probably, this is the only one that I could find that I was allowed to copy without breaking the law. But it's a pretty typical layout of a Gothic church, right? And it represents not only Lutheran churches, but also Protestant churches in general. This is probably a Roman Catholic sanctuary, if I had to guess, all right? But I want you to see just the big picture. I want you to see the big picture. And in your head, think about the structure here compared to the well, first of all, back you have the narthex like we do. You come in, and who sits in the congregation? It's called a nave, related to the word navy, because it represents how the ark on the water and how God saved Noah and his family through the ark on the water. Okay, more about that some other time. You see the aisles, of course. Then you go up. The transept is a big long word that basically means a part that goes across. Now, if you look at it like this, what shape do you see? A cross. Do you see the cross? It's on its side. That's not accidental. Okay? Then this map says sanctuary, but really what we would call it is the what is it called? Anyway, but that's not a bad word for it. Notice that you have the altar up there in the front, all right, right there in the sanctuary spot. And then you have a baptistry. We do not have burial chapels, obviously, or Lady Chapel or the Blessed Sacrament. So those are it's probably a Roman Catholic thing. But what I want you to see as we close today is, first of all, that our sanctuaries are often spaced out like crosses. And you can see that here. We have the aisle coming up into this space here. We also have this aisle going in this direction. Okay? So it's more prominent, of course, next door. But I want you to see the centrality of that, and also the way that it looks like a cross. Now, some churches that I know put their baptismal font right at the back of the nave. So right where you come into the sanctuary for worship, when you come in to sit down, they put their baptismal font right there. Why would you put the baptismal font right there? And I'm not saying we should. Where we put ours is fine. But why would somebody want to put the baptismal font there?
If you're not baptized, you do it now and then.
Yeah, right. Dip your hand in and throw some water on yourself. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. How is it that I came into the body of Christ through baptism? How is it that I enter into the presence of God through baptism? Right? You see the issue, what's going on there. There is nothing in the Bible that says that you must put your baptismal font in a certain place. It works for us to put it in front because then everybody can see what's going on. Okay? That's useful. It also is something for people to look at, like where we have ours up here. That way everybody can see. The other thing is, and just as a note, if you've ever been to the chapel at the seminary in Fort Wayne, their baptismal font is stationed permanently in the back, right? And a lot of times when we were there studying, we'd come in for chapel and I would take, dip my finger in and take a little bit of water and, do this number on myself, right? Just as a remembrance of my baptism, as a remembrance of our baptism. Okay, we are out of time. Reflections, thoughts?
The Orthodox Church still uses lots of incense. When did that stop in churches?
Yeah, there are churches in the LCMS that still use it. There are, but you can imagine the impractical nature of using that because many people are allergic to incense. So that, I think there are a lot of people that have just kind of been turned off by that because of the smell and the allergic reaction to it. It's also very pungent and can be overwhelming. So there's nothing wrong with it. We could use it, but I'm not saying we should use it, but that's why. That's where you get, like a lot of times at the seminary, before chapel, they would take one of those, like an incense lamp, so to speak, with chains on it and then swing it back and forth. Now, we associate that with Roman Catholicism and with the Orthodox Church, but there are LCMS churches that do it, right?
Wouldn't the incense be kind of counteracting the smell of the dead animals and stuff, so it wouldn't
Yeah.
waft into the...
Yeah, she makes an excellent point that part of the reason for the incense was to counteract the smell of the animal carcasses. So, any sort of animal that dies, like a human being, it rots and it smells. And you would have dead animals all over the altar in the tabernacle. So the incense was there to cover that up. Yeah, that's true too. Other questions? Okay. Hopefully this is something you can use as well. And I would encourage you, maybe we'll have a chance next week to look at these two here to talk about that. So thank you and have a great day. Don't forget about Wednesday service. And